Hello everybody, and today I'm going to talk about epidemics and pandemics. So, to begin my introduction, I just want to talk about the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic. So, as we might not know, I know I didn't really know the full difference between the two. So, an epidemic occurs when a disease is local to a certain area, so it hasn't spread across countries yet, across the world. It can still cause some chaos, but it's very localized. But on the other hand, we have a pandemic, which is when it is much more widespread, involving several countries across the world. So that's the difference. Now we can begin a little bit into more detail about what these can cause. But first, I want to talk about the history of them. Now, as we all know and unfortunately have experienced, is COVID-19, and that's the most common one that everybody's talking about because it's been the most recent and it's affected us. But there has been so many epidemics and pandemics across the world from decade to decade to decade. Like, this is not the first one that has ever been, a life-altering event. It's just the only thing that has affected us in so long. So, like I said, this is not a new topic. It's just something that has happened to us very recently, unfortunately. So, the topics that I will be discussing today is the effects of the pandemic on society, mental health, and family dynamics. So all three of these can obviously combine into one, but I'm going to talk about them separately. First, with a lot of studies that were done, and majority of these studies that I found and this research obviously will be from COVID that we just experienced 4 years ago. So, temporarily, unemployment was higher than 70%, and business took a huge hit. This is according to the World Bank in 2022. So, unemployment was at an all-time high. Temporary unemployment was at 70%. Obviously, some people never were able to return to their jobs, but a lot of it was temporary, but 70% is extremely high. Obviously, as I talked about mental health, much anxiety and depression were centered around all these major changes that occurred, as well as anxiety about health and concern about just overall everybody's individual well-being. So mental health was a very crucial time and challenge for many individuals. And lastly, as I mentioned, family dynamic was worsened due to the pandemic, as well as increase of rates of domestic violence. I will talk about this into further detail later on in the presentation. So, point one, like I just mentioned, the negative effects on society due to the pandemic. So, a study revealed that 50% of households were financially impacted by COVID-19, World Bank 2022. That's huge. That's half. And I don't think it came to any shock of anybody, but still seeing it on paper really makes it hit harder. I think a lot of that contributes to my next point, which is that many small businesses took a huge hit and either resulted in a huge financial loss or their businesses were lost completely. They had to foreclose. So that obviously really contributes to financial hardships. Also, if we take now a spin on more of a global government view, the global government debt increased as a result of the crisis response. So the government did a crisis response to try and help everybody financially, health-wise, all of it, to try and cover all their bases, which was great. Like, the point of this result of the crisis response had a good reason. Like, it had good thoughts behind everything. However, as a result, our government went into even further debt to try and help the panic. So this goes into the first movie now I watched two movies, and the first one I watched was Panic in the Street. And the reason I'm talking about this now is because it's a very good contrast between the way their government handled it and the comparison between our actual government handling COVID-19. In Panic in the Street, they really just tried to cover it up, and they gave the guy 48 hours to figure it out and put it to a stop. Obviously, it's not very realistic to what we experienced, but the government took a more secretive way to try not to cause as much panic. Obviously, when COVID hit, our government was very straightforward. They were very transparent for the most part about everything, but with Panic in the Street, it was kind of a good comparison between the two. Obviously, not very realistic, because like I said, you can't come up with a vaccine or a cure or a reason to stop all this in 48 hours necessarily, but it was an interesting spin on what we just experienced. So my point number 2 now is mental health. So mental health became a very serious issue during and after the pandemic. It continued to go. Mental health and substance abuse was a very major concern. So research also showed that females displayed the highest rates of anxiety and depression. I didn't go into much detail why females showed the most, but if we would care to kind of like take a guess, an educated guess would be that, you know, a lot of times they're the caretakers of the home. They take care of all the kids and stuff, so the financial burden could have been hard, as well as just the overall well-being of their kids and themselves. Like that's hard. It feels like you're very out of control, and as a mom you like to have control of the house. So I feel like females just, and it could be a lot on them. So that is what was showed, that females displayed very high rates. Obviously men were up there too. Men experienced the same amount, but females a little bit more. So like I said as well, the pandemic brought great uncertainty. So this was a time of unknowing, and that can cause extreme anxiety, not knowing when this was going to end, how many people were going to die from it, if there was ever even going to be a cure. So we can understand why mental health was on a very steep decline in 2020 and in the next following years, because as we know, it took a very long time for us to actually get back to normal. So also, a very interesting study and article that I found was that neuroinflammation and vascular damage might have contributed to these diseases. So a lot of people that had COVID, either during the time they had COVID or even after, they had a lot of brain fog and brain issues after that lingered as a result of COVID. And a lot of times this inflammation in the nerves and the vascular structures from COVID could contribute to, like I said, brain fog, but also all of this anxiety and depression as well. So it goes further than a physical feeling as well. So my second movie, going off of that, is the movie Contagion. So this was obviously a very dramatized version of everything that we went through and all the panic and all the issues and the relationships battles. But it was another cool movie to just see now, like, here's the Hollywood version, and then we have the actual reality of what we faced with this COVID-19 pandemic. So Contagion was another different spin on how they handled this outbreak that obviously was a lot more deadly than COVID. It like killed people instantly. But that's obviously Hollywood spin. But there is some reality to it, and it's very scary but interesting that it's somewhat relatable to an extent. So my last point is that family dynamics suffered. So as we all probably know very, very well, is you were stuck at home for a very long time quarantining with everybody's very close relatives that probably haven't quarantined together for this long. So issues arise. A study was done with multiple families that met certain requirements. So like they all had to be the same amount of family members, so they all had to meet the same requirement to really make this study seem more revealing and honest. So the study revealed that poor physical, psychological, and social health among family caregivers to the pandemic. So again, not much of a surprise, but it really, really did increase greatly, was all this tension between families. And like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, unfortunately, domestic violence did increase as well. So conclusion, I'm just going to go over all my information that I talked about because I know it was a lot. Like I said, many people suffered financially, and several businesses, especially small businesses, had to shut down. Mental health and substance abuse went to an all-time high, and women were displaying the highest rates of anxiety and depression during this time and after. And then lastly, family dynamics suffered greatly, resulting in increased rates of domestic violence. Caregivers struggled during and after the pandemic to just make ends meet, to just care for their family that might have seemed like a normal thing, which was now super, super challenging to do. So, like I said, the negative effects on society, the temporary unemployment shot to 70% at one point. And this is according to World Bank, and this was back in 2022. So we were already 2 years into the pandemic when they realized all this. And then again, the government went to a crisis response, which on paper, it was good. It needed to happen, but our global government debt increased greatly, which is why I compared the two movies, because the governments went in kind of totally different ways. And again, dramatized version, reality. So yeah, that was it. The family dynamics took even a harder hit. The study showed it all. So if I had suggestions for future consideration, I feel like we have some more answers and a sense of more of a plan now that we actually have experienced a real life pandemic and we don't just have to look at movies and Hollywood to get more ideas. So I feel like for the future, we might be a little bit more prepared. I know every pandemic and epidemic, whatever, hopefully we don't have any more, but everyone's different. We don't know what kind it could be, but we might have a little bit more experience with this now. And I think receiving more resources and aid will help minimize mental and financial hardships. Like I said before, just a minute ago, that now that we've experienced this, there might be some more tips that people can grab onto. People can lend a helping hand, more resources of mental health. Like, now we know how hard of a hit this can take on you physically and mentally. So thank you for listening. I appreciate it.